A child's loyalty is an ugly, honest thing. It cannot be bought with velvet ribbons or inherited through grand titles. When the porcelain shattered against the drawing room floor, the little girl did not run to the woman who birthed her. She bypassed the rustling satin of her mother's gown. She ignored the silent, rigid figure of her father. Instead, she buried her face in the coarse, lye-scented apron of a scullery maid. That was the exact moment the Duke finally understood. The drawing room always smelled of dried lavender and suffocating expectations. Arthur sat in the wing-back chair by the unlit hearth, an open ledger resting on his knee. The numbers blurred together. Outside, the November rain lashed against the leaded glass, a relentless drumming sound that usually set his teeth on edge. Today, however, it was a welcome distraction from the suffocating quiet inside the room. His wife, Catherine, sat opposite him. She was a woman constructed entirely of sharp angles and expensive fabrics. Her spine was unnervingly straight. Her blonde hair pinned back so tightly, Arthur often wondered if it caused the perpetual pinch between her brows. She smelled, as she always did, of heavy rosewater and the faint metallic tang of the sherry she drank before noon. Between them, sitting on the edge of a stiff brocade sofa, was Beatrice. Beatrice was 7 years old, but she possessed the hunched, anxious posture of an elderly clerk. Her feet dangled inches above the Persian rug. She was holding a saucer and a teacup, her small knuckles white with the strain of keeping them perfectly level. "Elbows in, Beatrice," Catherine snapped. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had the slicing quality of a wire cutting through clay. Beatrice flinched. Her left elbow jerked inward, knocking against her ribs. The china rattled. It was a terrible, sharp little sound. Arthur watched over the edge of his ledger. He should say something. He was the Duke of Ashbourne. He commanded hundreds of tenants, spoke in the House of Lords, ordered the felling of forests and the damming of rivers. Yet in his own drawing room, his throat felt stuffed with dry cotton. He shifted his weight, the leather chair groaning in protest. "Concentrate," Catherine said, turning a page of her magazine. She didn't even look up. "If you cannot hold a simple cup, how do you expect to survive the season when you are of age? You look like a frightened pigeon." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut. A small tremor started in her wrists. Arthur felt a sudden sharp twist in his gut, a flare of genuine annoyance, though whether it was directed at Catherine's cruelty or Beatrice's fragility, he couldn't immediately tell. He hated weakness, but he hated this theater of perfection even more. "Catherine, she's a child," Arthur muttered. His voice sounded gruff, hollow. "She is a duke's daughter," Catherine replied, finally looking up. Her pale blue eyes locked onto his, flat and unyielding. "She will not humiliate me. Hold it still, Beatrice." The tremor in Beatrice's hands worsened. The tea, scalding hot, deeply bitter, sloshed over the rim of the cup, splashing onto her thumb. Beatrice gasped. Her hands opened. The delicate bone china hit the hardwood floor just past the edge of the rug. It didn't just break. It exploded. Shards of painted porcelain sprayed across the floorboards. The dark brown tea pooled, creeping toward the pristine hem of Catherine's gown. Silence slammed into the room. Arthur gripped the arms of his chair. He braced for the screaming, but Catherine didn't scream. She stood up slowly, the silk of her dress hissing against the upholstery. Her face was perfectly blank, but a small muscle jumped in her jaw. "Look what you have done," Catherine whispered. Beatrice was trembling so violently she seemed to be vibrating. She was staring at her burned thumb, her breath coming in short, erratic hitches. She looked up at her mother. There was no plea for comfort in the child's eyes. There was only a primal, cornered terror. The heavy oak door to the drawing room pushed open. It was Martha. She had come to stoke the fire. She carried a scuttle of coal, her hands thick and rough, permanently stained with soot and lye soap. She wore a dull gray dress and an apron that had seen 3 days of kitchen grease. She smelled faintly of burned porridge and damp wool. Martha froze, taking in the scene, the spilled tea, the standing Duchess, the paralyzed Duke, the shaking child. "Oh, clean this up instantly," Catherine ordered, pointing a manicured finger at the mess. Then she looked at Beatrice. "You will go to your room. You will not have supper. You are a clumsy, thoughtless little girl." Catherine took a step toward her daughter, likely to grab her arm and march her to the door. Beatrice broke. A wet, strangled sob tore out of her throat. She didn't run to Catherine to beg for forgiveness. She didn't run to Arthur to ask for protection. Arthur watched, his breath catching in his chest, as his daughter scrambled off the sofa and sprinted across the room. She slammed into Martha. Beatrice buried her face in the maid's dirty apron, wrapping her small, trembling arms around Martha's thick waist. She clutched the rough fabric as if it were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Martha dropped the heavy coal scuttle. It hit the floor with a deafening clang that made Arthur jump, but the maid didn't notice. Without a second thought, without a glance at the Duke or the Duchess, Martha's large, calloused hands came down to cup the back of the little girl's head. "Shh, now. I've got you, little bird. I've got you," Martha murmured. Her voice was low, raspy, lacking any aristocratic refinement. It was the voice of a woman who yelled over boiling pots and haggled with fishmongers, and it was the most comforting sound Arthur had ever heard. Catherine gasped, a sharp intake of breath signaling pure, unfiltered outrage. "Get away from her! You are ruining her dress with your filth!" Martha didn't let go. She looked up. Arthur expected to see fear in the servant's eyes. Instead, he saw a hard, flat defiance. It was a look that said, "Fire me, beat me, do what you will. I'm not letting this child go." Arthur sat perfectly still, the ledger slipping from his knee to the floor. A cold, heavy realization washed over him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. His daughter didn't just prefer the maid. She felt safe with her. In a house containing 50 rooms, walls lined with silk, and a bloodline tracing back to kings, the only warmth Beatrice had found was in the arms of a woman who scrubbed the floors. Arthur looked at his wife, standing rigidly by the spilled tea, her face contorted in disgust. Then he looked at the maid, kneeling in the coal dust, holding the crying child. He had built an empire, but he had cultivated a wasteland. Arthur did not sleep that night. He lay in his massive canopy bed, staring at the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling until the shadows turned from pitch black to the bruised purple of early dawn. The mattress was stuffed with the finest goose down, yet he felt as though he were lying on slabs of ice. The image of Beatrice clinging to Martha's apron was branded behind his eyelids. He tried to trace the lineage of this failure. When had it begun? He rolled onto his side, the crisp linen sheets shifting coldly against his skin. It had begun exactly where it always did with his kind, at the altar. His marriage to Catherine had been a merger. Her family had political influence. His had vast tracts of untamed, resource-rich land in the north. On their wedding day, Catherine had looked breathtaking in heavy ivory silk, a perfect porcelain doll. But when he kissed her in the carriage afterward, her lips were tightly pursed, dry as parchment. She had tolerated his touch with a rigid endurance that made him feel like a trespasser in his own bed. Once Beatrice was born, a difficult bloody birth that left Catherine bedridden for a month and violently averse to the idea of a second child, the distance between them calcified into permanence. They took separate wings of the estate. They communicated through perfectly penned notes left on silver trays. Arthur told himself this was normal. It was how his parents had lived. It was how all of society operated. Love was a messy, lower-class affliction. Duty, honor, and legacy were the currencies of the realm. But duty felt remarkably hollow in the dead of night. He rose before the sun, pulling a heavy wool dressing gown over his shoulders. The manor was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint rhythmic sweeping of a broom somewhere downstairs. Arthur walked the long gallery, his slippers making no sound on the runner. He found himself drawn to the window overlooking the kitchen courtyard. The morning air was thick with fog, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Below, the household staff was already in motion, and there, by the pump, was Martha. She was scrubbing a heavy iron pot. The water must have been freezing. Her knuckles were raw and bright red. She moved with a heavy, ungraceful efficiency. There was nothing delicate about her. Her jaw was square, her hips broad under the thick wool of her skirt. Then the kitchen door creaked open. Out stepped Beatrice. Arthur instinctively leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the pane. What was she doing awake so early? She was in her white nightgown, a wool shawl thrown hastily over her narrow shoulders. She shouldn't be out there. It was damp. She would catch a chill. He raised his hand, intending to tap on the glass and order her inside. He stopped. Beatrice walked straight to Martha. She didn't tiptoe. She didn't hesitate. She stepped over a puddle of muddy water, the hem of her pristine white nightgown dragging through the muck. Martha didn't stop scrubbing the pot. She merely shifted her weight, making room on the wooden bench beside the pump. Beatrice sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. Arthur couldn't hear them through the thick glass, but he watched their interaction with the obsessive scrutiny of an explorer studying an alien species. Martha said something, not looking at the girl. Beatrice nodded. Martha reached into her deep apron pocket and pulled out a small, misshapen lump. An apple. It was bruised and small, likely a cast-off from the pantry. She tossed it to Beatrice. Beatrice caught it. She didn't ask for a knife. She didn't complain about the bruise. She simply bit into it, chewing thoughtfully. Then Arthur saw it. Beatrice's thumb, the one that had been scalded by the tea the day before, was wrapped in a strip of clean white linen. The knot was clumsy, practical. Not the work of the estate's physician, the work of a woman who knew how to bandage burns from a stove. Beatrice held out her bandaged hand, pointing to something on the cloth. Martha finally stopped scrubbing. She wiped her wet red hands on her apron, leaned over, and inspected the bandage. Then, casually, naturally, Martha brought the child's small hand to her face and pressed a quick, firm kiss to the linen. It wasn't a grand theatrical gesture. It was entirely ordinary. Beatrice smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed her face. The anxious, hunched little clerk disappeared, replaced by a 7-year-old girl. Arthur stepped back from the window. The cold from the floorboard seemed to seep directly into his bones. A sour ache formed tightly behind his ribs. He was a man who prided himself on his logic, on his ability to assess a situation and implement a solution. But how did one fix an emotional deficit? How did a man who only knew how to command learn how to comfort? Later that afternoon, Arthur found himself wandering near the nursery. It was a part of the house he rarely visited. It smelled of stale milk and old wax. The door was ajar. Catherine was inside. Arthur stopped in the hallway, pressing his back against the wall, listening. "Stand still." Catherine's voice rang out, sharp and irritated. "You are fidgeting like a street urchin. The dressmaker is coming in an hour, and you look like a disaster." "I'm sorry, Mother." Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "Sorry is useless, Beatrice. Presentation is everything. If you look unkempt, people will think we are careless. They will look down on us. Is that what you want?" "No, Mother." "Then act like you belong to this family." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. Act like you belong. The cruelty wasn't physical. It was systemic. It was a slow, dripping poison that convinced the child she was only valuable if she was perfect. He stepped into the doorway. Catherine stood in the center of the room, her hands on her hips, glaring down at Beatrice, who was wearing a pale blue silk dress. The child looked miserable. "Catherine," Arthur said. His voice was louder than he intended. Both mother and daughter jumped. Catherine turned, her expression instantly smoothing into a mask of polite inquiry. "Arthur, what a surprise. We are just preparing for the fitting." Arthur looked at Beatrice. She was staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly together, the bandaged thumb hidden from view. "Leave her be for today." Arthur said. Catherine's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon? The dressmaker has traveled from London. Cancel it. Pay the woman for her time and send her back. Beatrice is tired. She is not tired. She is obstinate, Catherine hissed, taking a step toward Arthur. The smell of rosewater hit him, cloying and heavy. Do not undermine me in front of her, Arthur. I'm trying to make her presentable. She is a child, Catherine, not a prized mare you are prepping for auction. The words tasted metallic on his tongue. They were the most honest words he had spoken to his wife in a decade. Catherine's face went completely white. For a moment, the veneer cracked, revealing a deep, vicious resentment beneath. You have never taken an interest in her upbringing before, she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Do not presume to walk in here now and play the concerned father. You don't even know her favorite color. It was a direct hit. Arthur felt the breath knock out of him. He opened his mouth to retort, but there was nothing to say. She was right. He didn't know. He looked over Catherine's shoulder at Beatrice. The little girl was watching them, her eyes wide, frightened by the conflict. She wasn't looking at him with hope. She was just bracing for the fallout. Arthur turned on his heel and walked away. He had tried to interfere, and he had failed. He retreated to his study, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and drank it until it burned the cowardice out of his throat. But the ache behind his ribs remained. Winter did not arrive slowly in the north. It struck like a hammer. By mid-December, the frost was thick on the window panes, and the drafty corridors of the manor felt like wind tunnels. It started with a cough, a dry, rattling sound that echoed from the nursery down to the second-floor landing. Arthur didn't think much of it at first. Children got sick. But by the third day, the cough had turned wet and heavy, and the household had grown unnervingly quiet. He sat in his study, trying to focus on a letter from his estate manager, but his mind kept drifting to the silence upstairs. He hadn't seen Beatrice in the drawing room for 2 days. He stood up, dropping the pen, and took the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the nursery corridor, he stopped. The smell hit him first, a sour, heavy odor of sweat, sickness, and the sharp tang of burning peppermint. Standing outside the nursery door, which was cracked open, was Catherine. She was wearing a heavy velvet shawl over her day dress. She held a lace handkerchief pressed tightly over her nose and mouth. Arthur approached her. "What's going on?" he demanded softly. Catherine didn't turn to look at him. She stared through the crack in the door. "She has a fever, a dreadful one. Dr. Harrison says it might be the sweating sickness." Her voice was muffled by the handkerchief, sounding nasal and panicked. "And you are standing out here?" Arthur asked, a hard edge creeping into his tone. "I cannot go in there," Catherine said, stepping back as if the door itself were diseased. "I have a delicate constitution. If I catch it, I will be bedridden for weeks. The winter ball is in 10 days, Arthur. I cannot be ill." Arthur stared at her. The sheer, unadulterated selfishness of her statement didn't shock him. It just exhausted him. He looked past her and pushed the door open. The room was sweltering. A massive fire roared in the grate, throwing dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick, hard to breathe. In the center of the room, in the small, rumpled bed, lay Beatrice. She was thrashing faintly, her head rolling side to side on the damp pillow. Her skin was a terrifying mottled red, glistening with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and punctuated by a wet, gurgling cough. She looked so small, so terribly, fragilely small. Arthur's feet felt like lead. He stepped into the room, but he stopped at the foot of the bed. Panic, raw and suffocating, gripped his throat. He had negotiated treaties. He had ordered men into battle during his brief stint in the cavalry. He had never been afraid of blood or conflict, but looking at his dying child, he was completely paralyzed. What if he touched her and made it worse? What if he couldn't fix it? He had no skills for this. He was entirely, utterly useless. A shadow moved from the corner of the room. It was Martha. She had shed her heavy apron. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing thick, muscular forearms. Her hair was falling out of its pins, plastered to her forehead with sweat. She held a ceramic basin of water and a rag. She walked past Arthur as if he were a piece of furniture. She didn't bow. She didn't acknowledge his rank. Martha sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. The bed frame groaned under her weight. She wrung out the rag, the water splashing loudly into the basin. "All right, little bird," Martha rasped, her voice thick with exhaustion. "We've got to cool you down." She began to sponge Beatrice's forehead, her neck, her wrists. Her movements were not gentle. They were firm, practiced, and relentless. Beatrice whimpered, a high, thin sound of distress, and tried to push the cold rag away. I know, Martha murmured. She didn't stop. She grabbed Beatrice's flailing hands with one thick fist and continued to wipe her down with the other. "It's horrid. I know it is. But you've got to let the heat out. Let it out. There's a good girl." Arthur stood rooted to the spot. He watched as Martha leaned over, putting her face close to Beatrice's burning cheek. And then Martha began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby. It wasn't a hymn. It was a bawdy, off-key pub song about a sailor and a barrel of ale. Martha's voice was terrible, scratchy, flat, and entirely unmelodic. But Beatrice stopped thrashing. The child's eyes fluttered half open, glassy and unfocused, but she turned her head toward the sound of that awful, gravelly voice. Martha kept singing, entirely off pitch, while she wiped the sweat from the girl's collarbones. "Martha?" Beatrice croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here," Martha said, stopping the song abruptly. She tossed the rag into the basin and scooped the child up. She didn't care about the sweat. She didn't care about the illness. Martha pulled Beatrice into her lap, pressing the burning little body against her own chest. She rocked her back and forth, back and forth. "I'm right here. Drink this." Martha reached for a cup on the nightstand, lifting it to Beatrice's cracked lips. "Sip it. It's bitter as sin, but it'll break the fever." Arthur watched his daughter drink obediently from the maid's hand. He looked toward the doorway. The door was now completely closed. Catherine was gone. She had retreated to her safe, sterile wing, leaving her sick child to the hired help. Arthur looked back at the bed. Martha was rocking Beatrice, resting her own chin on top of the child's damp head. The maid looked exhausted, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes. She had likely been up all night. Arthur took a step forward. His boots scuffed loudly against the floorboards. Martha looked up. For a second there was a flash of wariness in her eyes. She tightened her grip on Beatrice, a subtle, protective movement. Arthur felt a stab of shame so profound it made his knees weak. The maid thought he was going to intervene. She thought he was going to order her away, just as his wife would have. He swallowed hard, fighting past the cotton in his mouth. "What?" Arthur started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. "What do you need?" Martha stared at him. She looked at his immaculate tailoring, his polished boots, and then up to his face. She must have seen the desperation there, the raw, bleeding terror of a father who realized he was completely out of his depth. "The water in the basin is warm, Your Grace," Martha said slowly, her tone neutral but firm. "I need cold water from the pump outside, not from the kitchen tap. The pump water is freezing." Arthur looked at the basin. Then he looked at his own hands. Smooth, uncalloused hands. "Right," Arthur said. He took off his tailored coat and dropped it onto the floor. He rolled up his pristine white linen sleeves. He picked up the ceramic basin. "I will get it," he said. He didn't call for a footman. He didn't ring a bell. The Duke of Ashburn walked out of the nursery, down the grand staircase, and out into the freezing, sleet-filled night to pump water for the scullery maid who was saving his daughter's life. It was the first useful thing he had done in 7 years. The iron handle of the courtyard pump was coated in a thin layer of rime ice. It bit into Arthur's bare palms the moment he grasped it. He threw his weight against the lever, once, twice. The pipes groaned, a deep protesting sound from the belly of the earth, before the water gushed out. It splashed into the ceramic basin, violently cold. Droplets sprayed against Arthur's linen shirt, instantly soaking through to his skin. He didn't flinch. For the first time in a decade, the biting cold felt honest. Carrying the heavy, sloshing basin back up 2 flights of stairs was an exercise in agonizing slowness. Water crested the rim, dripping down his trousers and soaking his leather boots. His muscles, unaccustomed to manual labor, began to burn by the second landing. He pushed the nursery door open with his shoulder. The sweltering heat of the room hit him like a physical blow. Martha had stripped Beatrice down to a thin linen shift. The child's skin was still an angry, mottled scarlet. "Put it here," Martha ordered. She didn't look up, didn't use an honorific. She just pointed to the wooden stool beside the bed. Arthur set the heavy basin down. The water sloshed over the edge, pooling on the floorboards. Martha plunged a fresh rag into the freezing water. She didn't wring it out completely this time. She pressed the dripping cloth directly to the pulse point on Beatrice's neck. Beatrice shrieked, a raw, hoarse sound that tore through the quiet of the manor. She twisted, her small hands batting weakly at Martha's thick wrists. "Hold her," Martha said. Arthur froze. "What?" "Hold her down," Martha snapped, her voice cracking with strain. "She'll hurt herself thrashing. Pin her shoulders. Gently, but don't let her move." Arthur stepped forward. His hands hovered over his daughter. He was terrified he would break her. He pressed his palms down on her narrow shoulders. She felt like a trapped bird under his hands, her bones fragile, her skin radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. "I'm sorry, Beatrice," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. Papa has you." Martha shot him a brief, unreadable look, but her hands never stopped moving. From the neck to the underarms to the groins, she applied the freezing water. They worked in silence for what felt like hours. The grandfather clock down the hall chimed 2 in the morning, then 3. The rhythm of the room settled into a brutal, monotonous routine. Arthur fetched water. He held his daughter. He handed Martha dry towels. He watched the maid work with a relentless, unglamorous efficiency. He noticed the deep, dark half-moons under Martha's eyes. He noticed the way her knuckles were scarred, the skin thickened from years of caustic soap and boiling water. He also noticed that every time Beatrice cried out, Martha's jaw tightened, betraying a fierce, protective agony that Catherine had never once shown. Sometime past 4 in the morning, the shift happened. Arthur was leaning against the bedpost, his legs numb, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat. He was watching Beatrice's chest rise and fall. The harsh, rattling catch in her throat vanished. Arthur stood up straight. "Martha!" Martha had her eyes closed, her head resting against the mattress. She jerked awake, instinctively reaching for the damp cloth. She pressed the back of her heavy hand to Beatrice's forehead. She exhaled. It was a long, shaky sound. "She's broke." Arthur leaned over. The angry scarlet flush was fading from Beatrice's cheeks, replaced by a pale, clammy whiteness. The sweat pooling at her collarbones was no longer hot. Her breathing had slowed to a deep, even rhythm. She was sleeping. Actually sleeping, not trapped in a febrile delirium. Arthur slumped into the armchair by the fire. His knees simply gave out. He stared at the ceiling, his chest heaving as if he had just run 10 miles. A strange, wet heat pricked at the corners of his eyes. He squeezed them shut, burying his face in his hands. He didn't cry gracefully. It was a silent, ugly, shuddering thing. The terror he had kept walled off for 12 hours finally collapsed inward, crushing him. He felt a heavy weight drop onto the arm of his chair. He opened his eyes. Martha had set a chipped mug on the armrest. Steam curled from the rim. It smelled heavily of cheap tea and brandy. "Drink it," she said flatly. "You look like a corpse." Arthur took the mug. His hands were shaking so badly the ceramic rattled against his teeth. The liquid burned a hot, necessary trail down his throat. He looked at Martha. She was sitting on the edge of the bed again, pulling a dry woolen blanket over Beatrice's sleeping form. "Thank you," Arthur said. The words felt utterly insufficient, small and useless against the magnitude of what she had done. Martha didn't look at him. She just smoothed the blanket. "She's a good little bird. Doesn't complain much." "She complains to you," Arthur noted quietly. Martha paused. "She tells me when she's hungry, or when her shoes pinch. That ain't complaining, Your Grace. That's just a child wanting to be heard. The title, Your Grace," sounded strange coming from her mouth now. It felt like a barrier she had erected intentionally, a reminder of the chasm between them now that the immediate danger had passed. The heavy click of the door latch shattered the quiet. The door swung open. The hallway beyond was flooded with the gray, weak light of early dawn. Catherine stood in the doorway. She was immaculate. She wore a deep green velvet morning gown, her blonde hair pinned in perfect, complex coils. She held her lace handkerchief, though it was lowered to her chest. She surveyed the room. The overturned water pitcher, the soaked towels piled in the corner, the puddle of water ruining the Persian rug. Then her eyes landed on Arthur. He was sitting in the armchair, his tailored coat discarded on the floor, his white shirt stained with sweat and muddy water, a chipped servant's mug in his hand. He looked like a vagrant. Catherine's lip curled in an expression of profound, unmasked revulsion. "Arthur," she said, her voice thin and sharp. "What on earth are you doing? You look ridiculous." Arthur stared at his wife. For the first time in his life, he didn't see the aristocratic beauty, the strategic alliance, or the Duchess of Ashburn. He saw a woman who had slept soundly through the night her only child nearly died. "The fever broke," Arthur said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Well, thank heavens," Catherine sighed, though she didn't take a single step into the room. "Perhaps now we can restore some order to this household. The smell in here is atrocious. Open a window." She glanced at Martha, who was standing rigidly by the bed, her eyes trained on the floor. "And get her back to the kitchens. I will not have scullery maids lounging in the family wing." Catherine turned to leave. "Catherine," Arthur called out. She stopped, turning her head slightly. "Do not ever," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that made even Martha look up. "Speak of order in this room again." Catherine stiffened. Without another word, she swept out of the doorway, the heavy velvet of her gown dragging against the floorboards. Arthur looked back at the bed. Beatrice was still sleeping. He looked at Martha, who was already gathering the soiled towels into her thick arms, retreating back into her role as a servant. No, Arthur thought. The ice in his chest had finally cracked. He was not going back to the way things were. By the time the winter sun had fully risen, the hierarchy of the Ashbourne estate had been permanently fractured. Arthur sat behind his massive mahogany desk in his study. The fire was roaring, driving the damp chill from the room, but Arthur still felt the phantom cold of the pump water on his hands. He rang the silver bell on his desk. Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, appeared less than a minute later. She was a severe woman in black bombazine, possessing a ledger-like memory for every grievance and speck of dust in the house. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a stiff curtsy. "Mrs. Higgins," Arthur began, leaning back in his leather chair. He didn't offer a preamble. "The current nursemaid, Miss Gable. She is dismissed." Mrs. Higgins blinked, a rare crack in her composure. "Dismissed, Your Grace?" "She has been with the family since Lady Beatrice was born." "She is entirely useless," Arthur stated flatly. "She enforces discipline where comfort is required. Pay her 3 months' wages and see her put on the afternoon train to London." "Yes, Your Grace. Shall I begin interviewing replacements?" "No." Arthur picked up his heavy brass pen, rolling it between his fingers. "Martha will take the position." Mrs. Higgins stood perfectly still. Her eyes widened minutely. "Martha, Your Grace. From the scullery." Is there another Martha in my employ? No, your grace, but she is uneducated. She cannot read or write. She possesses no refinement. The Duchess will certainly object. The Duchess does not manage the payroll, Mrs. Higgins. I do. Arthur dropped the pen onto the desk with a heavy final clack. Martha will be moved into the antechamber of the nursery. She is to be outfitted with appropriate uniforms, though I expect them to be practical, not ornamental. She answers directly to me. Is that understood? Perfectly, your grace, Mrs. Higgins replied, her voice tight with suppressed scandal. By noon, the house was humming with the frantic, whispered energy of a disturbed wasp nest. Servants clustered in the pantries and the boot rooms, exchanging the news. The scullery maid, a woman who scraped pig fat off roasting pans, had been elevated to the family wing. Catherine's retaliation was swift and entirely silent. She did not come to Arthur's study to scream. She did not throw porcelain. Instead, she initiated a campaign of geographical isolation. When Arthur entered the dining room for supper, the long table had been cleared. Only a single-place setting remained at the far end. Catherine had ordered her meals brought to her private sitting room indefinitely. She locked the heavy oak doors separating her suite from the rest of the upper floor. She commanded the staff to divert any letters or invitations directly to her secretary, bypassing Arthur's desk. She was erasing him from the social architecture of their marriage. Arthur sat alone at the massive dining table, the silver clinking loudly against the china. He ate roasted mutton that tasted like sawdust. He didn't care about the silent treatment. In fact, the absence of her heavy rosewater perfume felt like a reprieve. What terrified him was the third floor, the nursery. 2 days after the fever broke, Beatrice was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of down pillows. The room no longer smelled of sickness. Martha had aired it out, leaving behind the crisp, sharp scent of winter draught and the faint, comforting aroma of baked apples. Arthur stood in the hallway, holding a small object wrapped in brown paper. He had ridden into the village that morning. He hadn't gone to the fine jeweler or the dressmaker. He had gone to the carpenter's shop, an establishment that smelled permanently of pine shavings and glue. He pushed the nursery door open slowly. Martha was sitting in the armchair by the fire, a basket of mending on her lap. She looked up, immediately setting the basket aside to stand. "Stay seated," Arthur said quickly, waving a hand. Martha paused, hovering halfway between standing and sitting, before cautiously settling back into the chair. The new uniform Mrs. Higgins had provided was a vast improvement. Stark black wool with a crisp white collar, but Martha wore it like armor, tugging uncomfortably at the stiff cuffs. Beatrice looked at Arthur. Her eyes, pale blue like her mother's but lacking the coldness, widened in apprehension. She pulled the quilt up to her chin. Arthur's heart sank. She was still afraid of him. He was the enforcer, the distant figure who watched quietly while her mother berated her. Why shouldn't she be afraid? He walked to the edge of the bed. He felt massive and clumsy in the room, his long legs threatening to knock over the small wooden tables. "How are you feeling, Beatrice?" he asked. His voice sounded too loud, too formal. "Better, Papa." "Thank you," she whispered. Arthur swallowed. He looked at the brown paper parcel in his hand. He thrust it forward abruptly. "I brought you something. From the village." Beatrice stared at the parcel. She didn't reach for it. She looked past Arthur, shooting a quick, frantic glance at Martha. It was a small, devastating look. "Is it a trap? Do I open it? What is the rule here?" Martha nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. Only then did Beatrice reach out. Her small fingers, still pale and slightly tremulous, took the package. She picked at the string carefully, terrified of tearing the paper. "You can rip it," Arthur said gently. Beatrice hesitated, then tore the paper down the middle. Inside was a wooden horse. It wasn't painted. It wasn't intricate. It was roughly carved, the wood smooth but clearly handcrafted, smelling sharply of fresh pine. It was a sturdy, indestructible thing. Beatrice touched the mane, running her thumb over the grooved wood. "I thought," Arthur started, his throat suddenly tight. "That the porcelain dolls you have, they are very fragile. They break easily. This will not break. If you drop it, it will just dent the floorboards." Beatrice looked up at him. The apprehension in her eyes had fractured, replaced by a profound, cautious confusion. She had never been given something designed to survive her clumsiness. She had only ever been given things she was expected to protect. "It won't break?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "No," Arthur said, taking a step back, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "You can throw it against the wall if you wish." A tiny strangled sound came from the armchair. Arthur glanced over. Martha had a hand clamped over her mouth, suppressing a bark of laughter at the idea of the Duke instructing his daughter to vandalize the nursery walls. Beatrice looked at the horse, then at Martha, and finally at Arthur. The corners of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a full smile, but it was genuine. "Thank you, Papa." Arthur nodded stiffly. "Rest." He turned and left the room quickly, his boots loud on the floorboards. As he closed the door behind him, he leaned against the wall in the hallway, letting out a long, shuddering breath. It was a clumsy attempt. It was imperfect, but he had not caused her to shake. He had not made her cry. For the Duke of Ashbourne, it was the greatest victory he had achieved in years. The uneasy truce held for exactly 1 month. January brought heavy snow, burying the estate under 3 feet of blinding white powder. The physical isolation mirrored the emotional isolation within the manor. Catherine remained a ghost in the West Wing, communicating only through written directives to the kitchen staff. Arthur spent his days managing the estate's finances and his evenings reading quietly in the study, intentionally leaving the door open so he could hear the faint, distant sounds of Beatrice and Martha playing in the nursery upstairs. The sound of Martha's terrible singing had become the most comforting noise in the house. But Catherine's silence was not surrender. It was a tactical retreat. It happened on a Tuesday. Arthur had been called away to a neighboring estate to negotiate a timber contract. He had planned to be gone until nightfall, but a broken carriage axle on the carriage ahead of his blocked the mountain pass, forcing him to turn back by early afternoon. He handed his snow-crusted coat to the footman in the grand foyer. The house felt wrong. There was no hum of sweeping, no distant clatter of pots from the kitchen. The air was unnaturally still, thick with a heavy, oppressive tension. Arthur walked toward his study, but stopped when he heard a voice echoing from the upper landing. Catherine's voice. It was not her usual flat, icy tone. It was raised, vibrating with a shrill, unrestrained fury. Arthur took the stairs 3 at a time. He rounded the corner of the second-floor landing and stopped dead. The scene played out in the hallway outside the nursery. Martha stood with her back against the wall. She was out of her uniform, wearing the rough gray wool dress she had worn in the scullery. At her feet sat a small, battered canvas sack. Catherine stood 10 feet away, flanked by 2 burly footmen Arthur had hired only a month prior. Catherine was wearing a riding habit, slapping her leather crop rhythmically against her gloved palm. And standing between them, her arms thrown wide, physically blocking her mother from the servant, was Beatrice. The child was trembling violently, but she was not crying. Her jaw was set, her small face contorted in a mask of pure, desperate defiance. "Move aside, Beatrice," Catherine hissed, raising the crop slightly. "No," Beatrice squeaked, her voice cracking. "She didn't do anything." "She is a thief and a degenerate," Catherine sneered, taking a step forward. "She has stolen a silver serving spoon from the dining room. It was found in her mattress. Now move, before I have the footman drag you back to your room." Arthur felt the blood drain from his head. A silver spoon. It was the oldest, most cliché framing tactic in the history of the aristocracy. Catherine hadn't even bothered to be creative. She had simply waited until she thought he was gone. "She didn't steal it!" Beatrice cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "You put it there. I saw Mrs. Higgins carrying it upstairs." Catherine's face went livid. "How dare you speak to your mother that way? Grab her," she ordered the footman. The men stepped forward. "If either of you touches her," I will break your arms." Arthur's voice didn't boom. It didn't echo. It was low, quiet, and absolutely lethal. Everyone froze. The footmen stepped back immediately, dropping their heads in terror. Catherine whipped around, her eyes widening in shock as she saw Arthur standing at the top of the stairs. Arthur walked slowly down the hall. He didn't look at his wife. He walked straight past her toward Beatrice. The little girl looked up at him. She didn't run to hide. She stood her ground, guarding Martha, but the tremor in her knees was violent. Arthur dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with his daughter. He reached out and gently laid a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Beatrice," he said softly. "You don't need to guard her anymore. I am here." Beatrice let out a ragged sob and collapsed forward, burying her face in Arthur's shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, picking her up off the floor. She felt solid against him, a heavy, living weight. He stood up, holding his daughter against his chest, and finally turned to look at his wife. "A silver spoon, Catherine?" Arthur asked. The contempt in his voice was thick enough to choke on. "You are not only cruel, you are entirely devoid of imagination." Catherine's face mottled with rage. "She is a thief. The staff witnessed the search. She will be turned out without a character, as is the law. You cannot stop it. I am the mistress of this house." "You are a tenant in it," Arthur corrected, his voice slicing through the air like a razor. "This estate belongs to me. The payroll belongs to me. And this child belongs to me. She is poisoning my daughter against me," Catherine screamed, finally losing the last shred of her aristocratic composure. She pointed a shaking, leather-gloved finger at Martha. "She is turning her into a savage. Look at her, clinging to a man like a common street rat. She has no decorum, no respect." "She has loyalty," Arthur interrupted loudly. The word echoed off the plaster walls. "Something you know absolutely nothing about." Catherine flinched, stepping back as if physically struck. Arthur looked at the two footmen. "Take Lady Ashbourne's trunks from the West Wing. Have them loaded onto the carriage. She will be returning to her brother's estate in London." Catherine's mouth dropped open. The color vanished from her face, leaving her entirely gray. "You cannot banish me. It will cause a scandal. Society will ruin you." "Let them," Arthur said. The cynicism in his tone was profound, rooted in a sudden, liberating exhaustion. "Let them talk. Let them whisper in their drawing rooms. I do not care about society, Catherine. I care about the fact that my daughter was bleeding on your carpet, and you cared more about the stain than her skin." Catherine stared at him. She looked at his face, searching for a bluff, for a crack in his resolve. She found nothing but cold, hardened iron. She swallowed hard, her chest heaving. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply lifted her chin, clutching her riding crop tightly. "You will regret this. You're choosing filth over your own bloodline." "No," Arthur replied quietly, tightening his grip on Beatrice, who was listening silently against his collarbone. "I'm choosing a mother for my daughter, because the one who birthed her abandoned her years ago." Catherine turned on her heel. She walked down the hallway, her boots clicking sharply, and descended the stairs. She didn't look back. Not once. Arthur stood in the quiet hallway until he heard the heavy front doors slam shut. He slowly lowered Beatrice to the floor. The child wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, sniffing loudly. Arthur looked at Martha. She was still standing against the wall, her canvas sack at her feet. She looked terrified, expecting Arthur's wrath to turn on her next. "Pick up your bag, Martha," Arthur said, his voice dropping back to a tired, normal register. Martha gripped the handles of her sack, her knuckles white. Where am I going, Your Grace?" Arthur looked at the closed nursery door, and then back at the rough, calloused woman who had saved his family. "Take your bag back into the nursery," Arthur said, "and unpack it. We have a lot of work to do." The absence of the Duchess had a distinct physical weight. It was not a sudden lightness, as Arthur had naively expected. It was a vacuum. For the first 2 weeks, the manor operated in a state of suspended animation. The servants walked on the balls of their feet, flinching whenever a door slammed, expecting Catherine's sharp reprimands to echo from the rafters. The heavy scent of rosewater stubbornly clung to the velvet drapes in the west wing, a phantom lingering in the threads. Arthur found that unlearning a decade of rigid indifference was a brutal, ungraceful process. He did not magically transform into a warm, effusive father. He didn't know how. He would sit in the nursery for an hour in the evenings, his long legs awkwardly folded under a child-sized chair, watching Beatrice stack wooden blocks. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was too loud, his questions too formal. "Did you find your supper adequate, Beatrice?" It sounded like he was addressing a visiting diplomat. Beatrice, in turn, remained cautious. She no longer trembled when he entered a room, but she kept a measured distance. She still waited for permission to speak. She still hid her hands under her pinafore when they were dirty. The bridge between them was Martha. Martha refused to adapt to the aristocratic expectations of a governess. When Mrs. Higgins attempted to give her lessons in elocution, Martha simply walked out of the room. She kept her thick, rolling vowels and her calloused hands. One evening in late February, the unspoken tension finally snapped. Arthur was attempting to read to Beatrice from a thick, leather-bound volume of Greek myths. The language was dense, the print tiny. Beatrice was sitting on the edge of the sofa, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes glazing over with polite boredom. "Arthur," Martha interrupted. Arthur stopped mid-sentence. He looked up. Martha was sitting by the fire, shelling peas into a tin bowl. She had dropped his title completely the day Catherine left, a quiet rebellion he had chosen not to correct. "She doesn't understand a word you're saying," Martha said, tossing a green pod into the fire. It popped with a sharp hiss. "You're putting her to sleep, and not the good kind." Arthur stiffened. "I am educating her. The classics are dry as bone," Martha cut in. She set the bowl down and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over, took the heavy book from Arthur's hands, and shut it with a loud thwack. "Tell her a story, out of your own head." Arthur stared at the maid in horror. "I don't know any stories." "Make one up," Martha said flatly. She turned to Beatrice. "Your papa is going to tell you about a horse, a massive, angry brute of a horse." She looked pointedly at Arthur. "Go on." Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Beatrice. The child was leaning forward, the polite boredom completely gone, replaced by a hungry, wide-eyed curiosity. "Well?" Arthur cleared his throat. His collar felt incredibly tight. "There was a horse in the north, a black stallion." "What was his name?" Beatrice whispered. Arthur blinked. "Bucephalus." Martha rolled her eyes. "Lord help us, call him Barnaby." "His name was Barnaby," Arthur corrected, a strange nervous heat creeping up his neck. "And he was terrible. He kicked a hole straight through the stable wall." Beatrice gasped, a genuine, unpolished sound. "Did he run away?" "He did," Arthur said, leaning forward, realizing suddenly that he was no longer reciting. He was remembering a wild, unbroken colt his own father had ordered shot when Arthur was a boy. "He ran into the pine forests, and they sent 10 men to catch him. He told the story poorly. He stumbled over words, he lost the plot twice, and he didn't know how to end it. But when he finished, Beatrice was sitting cross-legged on the sofa, leaning into his knee. Martha went back to shelling peas, a faint, satisfied smirk on her face. Arthur rested his hand tentatively on his daughter's head. The hair was soft, smelling faintly of the lavender soap Martha used. For the first time, Beatrice didn't flinch. She just leaned into the weight of his palm. Spring arrived with a violent thaw, turning the estate grounds into a sea of thick, churning mud. With the melting snow came the mail. Society had finally caught wind of the Ashbourne scandal. Arthur stood by the window in his study, a silver letter opener in his hand. The desk behind him was littered with thick vellum envelopes bearing aristocratic crests. He had opened 3. That was all it took. Profoundly shocked by your sudden separation, the presence of a common laborer raising a child of the peerage is deeply concerning. For the sake of your reputation, you must send the girl to boarding school immediately. They were polite, perfectly constructed threats. The message was clear: conform or be excised. Arthur walked back to the desk. He didn't read the rest. He swept his arm across the mahogany surface, knocking the entire pile of letters into the roaring hearth. The wax seals melted instantly, hissing as the expensive paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. He didn't care about the dukes and the earls in London, but the isolation was beginning to affect Beatrice. In April, Arthur took her into the village. It was a simple errand to the apothecary, an excuse to get her out of the manor. Martha stayed behind to argue with the butcher over a delivery of salted pork. As Arthur and Beatrice exited the apothecary, the brass bell ringing above the door, they nearly collided with Lady Heiress, the wife of a neighboring baron. Lady Heiress was wrapped in a fur-trimmed cloak, her face powdered to a ghastly pallor. She stopped. Her eyes darted from Arthur to Beatrice, then visibly scanned the street behind them, looking for the disgraced Duchess. Finding only empty cobblestones, Lady Heiress's lips thinned into a tight, bloodless line. "Your Grace?" Lady Heiress said. Her tone was completely devoid of grace. It was sharp, brittle. She looked down at Beatrice, her gaze catching on the muddy hem of the child's wool coat. "I see the child is adapting to her new circumstances, though one wonders who is managing her hygiene." Beatrice shrank instantly. The confident girl who had asked about Barnaby the horse vanished. The anxious, hunched clerk returned. She stepped behind Arthur's leg, hiding her face in the folds of his overcoat. Arthur felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. It was the same primal fury he had felt when Catherine raised the riding crop. He could have crushed Lady Heiress with a single cutting remark. He could have leveraged his superior title to humiliate her in the street. Instead, he looked at his daughter, trembling against his leg. "Her hygiene is perfectly managed, Lady Heiress," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "As is her spirit. I find she thrives when she is not suffocated by the miserable, judgmental company of her supposed peers." Lady Heiress gasped, stepping back as if he had spat on her shoes. "You have lost your mind, Ashbourne." "Good day, madam," Arthur said. He didn't wait for her to move. He walked forward, forcing Lady Heiress to step off the wooden boardwalk and directly into the ankle-deep mud of the street to avoid him. He guided Beatrice down the road. He didn't take her back to the carriage. Instead, he stopped at the baker's window. It smelled of yeast, burned sugar, and hot butter. Arthur bought a large, sticky plum tart. It was not a pastry meant for the aristocracy. It was messy, oozing with dark purple jam. He handed it to Beatrice right there on the street. "Eat it," Arthur said. Beatrice looked at the tart, then looked up at him, her eyes wide with lingering fear from the encounter. "We don't have plates, Papa. Mother said we never eat in the street." Arthur knelt down in the dirt, ruining the knees of his tailored trousers. He looked directly into her eyes. "Your mother is gone, Beatrice," Arthur said quietly. "And those people, the ones who look at you like you are a problem to be solved, they do not matter. Let them starve on their manners. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be messy." Beatrice hesitated. Then she took a bite. The pastry flaked, falling onto her coat. The dark purple jam smeared across the corner of her mouth. It was a disaster. Arthur smiled. It was a small, fractured expression, but it was real. He reached out and wiped a crumb from her chin with his thumb. "Is it good?" he asked. Beatrice nodded, her mouth full, a tiny, defiant spark returning to her eyes. "Yes, Papa." 2 years passed. The estate did not collapse into ruin, though the guest rooms remained largely empty. The staff stopped tiptoeing. The heavy velvet drapes in the west wing were taken down and burned in the courtyard, replaced by light linen that let the afternoon sun bleed across the floorboards. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The drawing room smelled of wet wool, burning oak, and the sharp metallic tang of ink. Arthur sat at his desk in the corner, reviewing a stack of architectural plans for a new tenant mill. He was older now. The gray had fully claimed the hair at his temples, and the harsh, rigid lines of his jaw had softened into something resembling peace. The doors to the drawing room burst open. Beatrice ran in. She was 10 years old now, and she did not glide like a ghost. She ran with the heavy, uncoordinated enthusiasm of a child. Her dark dress was smudged with chalk, and her hair had escaped its single braid, curling wildly around her face. She was chasing a hound puppy, a clumsy, big-pawed creature Arthur had bought from the groundskeeper. "Come back!" Beatrice laughed, diving for the dog. The puppy skidded on the Persian rug, crashing hard against a delicate mahogany side table. The table tipped. On top of it sat a blue and white porcelain vase, an antique that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother. It slid off the polished wood. It hit the floorboards with a devastating explosive crash. Shards of painted porcelain sprayed across the room, settling into the fibers of the rug. The room went instantly, terrifyingly silent. The puppy scrambled under the sofa. Beatrice froze. She stood over the shattered remains of the vase, her chest heaving. The laughter died in her throat. Arthur dropped his pen. The sudden silence pulled him back. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the past flickered in the room. He remembered the spilled tea. He remembered the terror. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Beatrice's shoulders hitched. She looked down at the broken pieces, her hands automatically balling into tight fists at her sides. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the old conditioned panic bleeding back into her voice. "Papa, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was running—" "Beatrice," Arthur interrupted. He walked around the desk. He didn't look at the vase. He walked straight to his daughter, stepping heavily over the jagged pieces of porcelain. He stopped in front of her. He reached out and took both of her tightly clenched fists in his hands, gently prying her fingers open. He inspected her palms. "Did you cut yourself?" Arthur asked, his voice low and steady. Beatrice blinked, looking up at him in confusion. "No." Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He let go of her hands and reached up to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "Good." The drawing room door opened again. Martha walked in, carrying a basket of dried kindling. She looked at the shattered vase, then at Beatrice, and finally at Arthur. She didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She just sighed, a heavy, long-suffering sound, and set the basket down. "Well," Martha grumbled, putting her hands on her hips. "That was the ugliest thing in this house anyway. I've been wanting to knock it over for 2 years. Beatrice let out a sudden, watery bark of laughter. The tension broke, shattering as completely as the porcelain on the floor. "Go to the kitchen, little bird," Martha said, waving a hand. "Tell cook to give you a slice of that honey cake before I eat it all. I'll get the broom." Beatrice didn't run. She walked over to Arthur, threw her arms around his waist, and buried her face in his waistcoat for a brief, tight second. Then she turned and bounded out of the room, the puppy scrambling out from under the sofa to follow her. Arthur stood in the quiet room, looking down at the broken pieces of his inheritance. It was just clay. It was just dirt, painted and fired and sold as something precious. He looked at Martha, who was already on her knees, sweeping the shards into her apron with her bare hands. Arthur got down on the floor beside her. He picked up a jagged piece of blue porcelain. "I can do it, Arthur," Martha muttered, swatting lightly at his hand. "I know," Arthur replied softly. He tossed the shard into the pile in her apron. "But we live here together. We clean it up together." Martha paused. She looked at him, her hard, cynical face softening just a fraction. She didn't say thank you. She just gave a single sharp nod and kept sweeping. Arthur sat on the floor of his ruined, perfect drawing room, the smell of wood smoke and lye soap filling the air, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. And that's the reality of a home, isn't it? It's not built on polished silver, inherited titles, or the flawless performance of duty. It's built in the messy, imperfect moments when we choose compassion over control. It's the realization that sometimes the most valuable things we own are the ones we allow to break so that the people we love don't have to. If Arthur and Beatrice's journey, unlearning perfection, moved you, hit that like button, share this story with someone who makes you feel safe, and subscribe to our channel for more raw, deeply human storytelling. Until next time.